Okay, good evening. My name is Rabbi Efrem Goldberg. I have the privilege of serving as the Rabbi of Boca Raton Synagogue. And I'm so honored that you've joined us, whether it is on the phone call, on Facebook Live, or on YouTube Live this evening for a really important topic. And I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with than my good friend Moshe Yachnes. Welcome, Moshe. Just to give you a word of background and then an introduction to the conversation this evening, and then we're going to get right into it because that's why people are tuned in, to be able to have a meaningful and productive conversation. Moshe graduated Fordham University with a master's in clinical social work. He's extensively trained in addiction therapy as well as fulfilled the requirements for a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor. Importantly, he's been trained by the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals and is a certified sex addiction therapist. He's worked with individuals struggling with sex trauma, compulsive sexual behaviors, and issues of infidelity in both inpatient and outpatient settings. Founder and director of Orthodox Rehab Center, and he maintains a private practice with offices in Hollywood and Boca Raton. I don't know how you get it all done, but we're so grateful you found the time to have this important conversation tonight. I just want to set the parameters of what we're going to talk about, and then we'll open the floor and really dive right in. Tonight's conversation about compulsive behavior, intimacy, the challenge and struggle so many have. Those who've acknowledged the struggle, those who are even unaware of their own struggle, those who others are aware of their struggle, but a struggle of compulsion towards online viewing. With the proliferation of technology, it's brought incredible blessing and bracha into our lives, but it also is a double-edged sword and brings with it unbelievable challenges as well. Not only the compulsion and draw to watch, but the negative behaviors that are associated and that go with it. And while these challenges are in the world at large, ironically or paradoxically, they're in our community to a degree even more. Recently I heard research quoted which said that Google or analytic tools analyzed the geographic locations where the most pornography was being watched and the places where the people are most religious, whether it be evangelicals, Mormons, Christians, and religious Jews, actually gave the highest return of data of people who are watching pornography. So the more insular, the more withdrawn, some would argue the more suppressed, or the more boundaries there are to a community, in a certain degree, the greater this challenge. So what we're going to talk about tonight with a person who I've worked with people I know, and a person who's an expert, is how some really practical ways to understand this compulsion, to be able to develop a healthy attitude towards it, practical steps about how we can manage our viewing, our sexual identity, behaviors, online, offline, in our lives, in intimate settings. What we're not going to talk about is halacha. We're not going to talk about psak, maybe every now and then. I'll try to weave something in, but it's not a shir. We're not going to talk about the Jewish law perspective because it would be a very short conversation. We know that Jewish law absolutely prohibits at least male masturbation and the emission or wasting of seed, the viewing of graphic images or areas that should be covered that are uncovered. All of the sources for that are not for now, and that's not our topic. But really to be able to take advantage of an expert who can give us some guidance. So, Moshe, with that, please share your introductory words.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Rabbi Goldberg. It's humbling to be here, and I'm excited to open a dialogue with everyone. The goal here this evening is to start a conversation. Perhaps there's uncomfortability around this topic, and we know that there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of people struggling on this level, and our hope is to launch a conversation here. I want to begin with a quick story. I heard this from Dr. Patrick Carnes, who is the world-renowned leading expert in understanding processing addiction, which we'll talk a little bit more about it, understanding compulsive sexual behaviors, intimacy disorder, attachment challenges. And he says, there's a man walking in a forest, and he gets to a body of water. And he's scared. He doesn't know how to get across the water, so he pulls out a hatchet, and he chops down some wood, and he successfully gets himself, makes a little raft, and he successfully gets himself to the other side of the water. But then he's faced with a dilemma. He doesn't know what to do. He's fearful that perhaps further down the road there'll be another body of water. So he takes this raft, it's a 5x5, and he throws it over his shoulders, and he starts to schlep this raft, and his back starts to break, and his shoulders start to ache, and he's dealing with the consequences of this savior. What happens is the fear of the potential future body of water prevents him from putting down that raft. And really, this is an analogy to what the disease of escape is all about. When somebody is struggling with overwhelming feelings of pain, of loneliness, of anger, of a inability to establish healthy intimacy in a relationship, some type of trauma that they haven't fully processed, inability to modulate their emotions, all those powerful, overwhelming demons that we struggle with. When a person finds their escape, whether it's drugs, alcohol, or online use, the orgasmic experience, if you will, of compulsive masturbation or sex addiction is an escape of sorts. And obviously it doesn't help teach a person how to swim in those waters. And the goal really of recovery is to effectively enable someone and help them learn how to swim so they're not dependent on the escape or they're not dependent on the raft that's short-lived. It's a flawed solution, and it doesn't really effectively create healthy intimacy and happy living ultimately.
So I want to interrupt you already to get
Sure.
to get right into it, and I want to ask an explicit question,
Sure.
but in a tanua kind of way, and really that's an important word of introduction as well. We've structured this that people can call in on a conference call or be watching it with these different mediums, because the goal is to tackle a topic that people aren't going to show up in person, and we hope that the people listening, and I want to congratulate Yashikok for the courage to listen, hopefully not just voyeuristically, but because we all want to improve and we want to grow in these areas. So, when it comes to some of these other behaviors, there's a moderate way of doing it, and there's an excessive way of doing it. When it comes to the issue of watching pornography, masturbation, is it really addiction? Is it really coming because someone's got a bad relationship with their mother, their marriage is unhappy, they're unfulfilled at work, they have a low self-esteem? Don't people just have a really high sex drive? Isn't it a sexualized world? Isn't that the Yetzer Hara? Hinei Tov Ma'ah, Kadosh Baruch Hu created this Yetzer Hara. God created this drive within man, without which we wouldn't populate the world. We wouldn't have a sense of continuity. So talk, if you will, for a moment about putting this negative label as if it's an addiction rather than it being a natural desire, natural behavior. Or put differently, where do you draw the line between somebody who has sexual attraction, healthy sexual desire and drive, and where does it cross that line into addiction, compulsive behavior?
Absolutely. So it's a great question. Thank you for opening that, open up the questions in this way, because really it's when a person looks at any compulsive behavior, there is a inability to control the behavior that they're doing. It might start with an expression of some sorts, but when a person develops the inability to control that behavior, when there are negative consequences associated with that, when a person has attempts to stop but they build a certain tolerance towards that behavior, when it might start off as exploration or perhaps in a joyful experience, but then there is a certain relationship that becomes a person starts to develop deep preoccupations. They can't escape the thought of their planning. Their day revolves around when they're going to act out. They wake up in the morning, they think about, they have a half-hour break at lunch, or they have internet access, and it develops a certain neurochemical reaction where the pleasure centers in the mind start to wire right from the get-go. Research really indicates that, they did brain scans, and they demonstrated that the high of acting out sexually is equal to the high of a cocaine high, actually. The stimuli that happens when a person's acting out is the same. It mirrors that.
So just clarify. Define acting out sexually versus having a healthy, appropriate sexual experience, let's say in the context of marriage and a loving relationship within the boundaries of halacha.
Absolutely. So, sex is there, obviously, it's part of a natural need that we all have, and it's actually the result or the outgrowth or the last step of formulating a connection. Acting out is really referred to when there's an escape towards that behavior. The truth of the matter is, when you think about it, orgasm is the death of sex, right? It's the lead up. It's the steps that take both, two partners, man and his wife, that develop a certain process of connection. When a person's acting out, they find themselves compulsively acting out. What they're doing is there's a fear to develop intimacy. It's actually at the core, it's an inability to develop healthy intimacy. I had clients one time told me that it's easier for them to act out with a computer screen than with a real person, because it requires vulnerability, it requires risk, it requires a certain level of confidence, and there's a lot of fear in that.
So again, and help our audience understand, help me understand, people who are using it compulsively, and somebody who's acting out, and somebody who is avoiding healthy intimacy in this unhealthy way. But what about the population who says, I'm married and I have a healthy sex life, and maybe our libidos are not entirely in sync, but for the most part, it's a satisfying, intimate life. But I also engage in this because it's pleasurable. Just like I eat a good sandwich, I have good dessert, I enjoy watching a good football. There are sensory experiences in life I enjoy, and this is another one of them. And if I'm watching that or doing that, it's not to avoid intimacy. I have that too, but this is also something I enjoy.
Okay, good. So, and that really brings us to defining what constitutes an addictive or a compulsive behavior. If a person does it once without any consequences, then it's not an addiction. If a person does it once and it goes against their value system, their spouse will be upset at them, they themselves don't really want to engage in this behavior, that would constitute the addictive component. It's the relationship with the behavior rather than the behavior itself. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we look at. We look at what is the individual's relationship with that behavior. Are they okay doing what they're doing? Do they feel compelled to do that? Is their ability to stop their behaviors? Have they attempted to stop? Has the behavior intensified over time? Very often you hear of somebody starting to watch pornography once a week, and then it increases to twice a week, and then there's a need every day. That would define it as an addiction. There are three major criteria that we look at to define it as an unhealthy experience, and that is, number one is continued behavior despite negative consequences. Number two is the ability to, the need for more, if you will, a tolerance that's built. There's an article I recently read that the Android, the pornography industry linked up with the Android phone, and they created in their device. There's a eye tracking software that actually recreates the imagery based on the focus of the individual,
right?
Which really talks to the massive exposure and the intensity of that exposure that takes place. People are exposed to things that they don't want to be exposed to, and then they feel that dopamine rush. So their body and their minds and their hearts tell them they want more, and then they don't feel satisfied at the end of that session because they went with that to escape an issue that was going on here.
So somebody who's listening or watching, help them understand or identify within themselves that they have a problem. Okay. Or maybe their loved one knows that they have a problem. Mm-hmm. Where is that line? Where's that boundary? And again, I want to make clear, and I know I'm repeating myself, that from a halachic perspective, a Torah Jewish perspective, the line is at zero. There's never okay to be watching or engaging or acting out in a way that's wasting seed and so on and so forth. There are rules for intimacy, and within the context of intimacy, pleasure is not only permissible, it is a goal, it's a mitzvah, it's an ideal, it's an obligation, a responsibility a husband has towards a wife. So I want to clarify again, halachically, there's no tolerance or no permissibility of acting out. But from a clinical standpoint, in helping the people who are trying to overcome, what can someone identify within their own experience, behavior, that will help them realize that they have a problem? Mm-hmm. And let's then talk about some of the steps about what they can engage in to address the problem.
Okay, so some of the things in understanding that cycle of addiction that we talk about, there's the stimulus that takes place in step one. Whatever that stimulus is, whether it's a physical stimulus, whether it's something you saw, you heard, that develops to a certain preoccupation that we discussed. There's ritualization that takes place after that. Then the acting out behavior takes place, and then there is immediately a shame and a guilt cycle that begins. So the first step in acknowledging whether they're struggling on this level would be to look at their relationship with the behavior. Are they okay? Do they feel that, at the end of their workday, they're engaged in certain acting out behaviors, but then they start to think about it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or they start to think about it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or their wife wants them to come into the kitchen and have a conversation, and they're preoccupied with planning. Or
so it's not a matter of frequency.
Correct.
It's not that if you watch pornography and masturbate once a week, you're not an addict. If you do it 3 times a day, you are.
Absolutely.
It's not the frequency. It's the relationship with the behavior.
Correct, and that's really the theme, and that's really something to think about. What is a person experiencing when they think about the behavior, when they think about the acting out? Is there shame associated with that? Is there guilt? Is there inability to be present in the context of a conversation? I have clients that have told me that they would be intimate with their spouse, and then they would go to the bathroom and act out, because it's not filling a need of intimacy. It's actually filling the escape because there's an inability to develop healthy intimacy.
And what is the escape from? Is it different for everybody?
It is different for everybody. There are about really 6 different components that we look at that indicate there's an inability to modulate emotions. That means a person's fear. A person is overwhelmed with anxiety, with fear, with pain, There's a person that experienced sexual trauma that has never really processed it. That's another big indicator. If a person's in a relationship currently, but they don't feel securely attached, very often a person could develop short-term relationships, but then when it comes to sharing intimate details about themselves, when it comes to being vulnerable, they shy away. They put up a blockage. And in the context of a relationship, if a spouse is noticing that their husband or their wife can't really stay with the depth of the relationship, that's something to look at. What is preventing them from feeling that safety, from experiencing that trust and that honesty? Then there are certain behavioral indicators, like scheduling that is off, excessive amount of time spending on the computer. If there is an inability to have healthy intimacy, if for whatever reason that they can't put their finger on, their sex life is actually being affected in a negative way, this is something to look at. Where else is that stimulation being addressed?
Because in other words, pornography can provide a stimulation that live people can't. Maybe
Correct.
The expectation of what you're watching, the acts that you're watching, they're not consistent with reality, with the way people behave in reality, so it provides an overstimulation that can't even be
That can't be matched in reality. Correct, and it also
so
builds that tolerance.
So
I mean, you have machine-enhanced arousal, as an example, where again, there's a line in psychology that says that neurons that wire together fire together, and when that dopamine is accessed and the pleasure centers in the mind are stimulated, whether it's oxytocin or dopamine, adrenaline, a lot of the fear or the fear of being caught creates a certain anxiety. The chase in acting out, the secrecy creates a certain adrenaline rush that can't be matched in real life, and that's a rush that people look for because they don't feel there's an emotional disconnect, so they chase that high for the chase itself, and that's something to think about as well. If somebody finds themselves preoccupied with the secrecy about their acting out behavior, those are some basic indicators.
So what can it be replaced with? If people are using it as an escape, if it's avoidance, if people are covering up for some other dysfunction or challenge within themselves, how does one start to climb out of this hole? So somebody, let's just review for a second. Again, it's not about the frequency. It's not about how often they're watching, how often they're engaging or acting out, but it's a matter of the relationship. So it could be that one is negative about this behavior because religiously we have a negative.
It goes against their belief system. They're doing something that they don't want themselves to be doing. They feel compelled to do something that they don't want to be doing.
And we'll come back to that because we're going to talk about guilt in a moment and the role of guilt and engaging in behavior that makes you feel guilty, but re-engaging in it in the cycle of guilt and then feeling so low that you can't even picture yourself climbing out. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the person who's behaving in this, so again, it's not about the frequency, it's about the relationship with the behavior. They dislike themselves for doing it because either religiously they're uncomfortable with it or they know that it's having a negative impact or they're escaping something. What can that drive be replaced with?
So I want to just comment on some of the other indicators. I mean, this double life syndrome is something that shows up all the time. Hundreds of people actually have told me that they show up outside, people in shul, their family assumes that they're a certain way, but they themselves know what type of person they are. And that living with the double life, managing that double life, creates more anxiety, which perpetuates the continuous need to act out because they can't deal with the overwhelming emotions. And the fear and the shame associated with that is overwhelming. Honesty is really the first step. Acknowledging that there's an issue is the first step towards recovery. And I'm happy that you brought that up, Rabbi, because there is hope in this. There's a roadmap that can be implemented. The first step is going to be putting some space between the compulsive behavior and the individual themselves, obviously. To create a paradigm shift in their thinking is going to be the step 2. We recommend abstinence for a short-term period. There are behavioral recommendations. Abstinence from the behavior. Understand for a person and this is really the therapeutic process, but when a person understands that there are certain indicators which lead to the preoccupation, there are certain indicators which develop that ritualization, those are the steps that a person has control over. Once those boundaries...
So again, let me bring it from the clinical 30,000 foot level down to the practical. A guy or a woman, and I don't know if you want to address the amount that gender plays a role here or the occurrence of this phenomenon or challenge within the different genders, but people assume it's only one gender. It's not true.
It's not at all.
I'm sure you have patients of both genders. So a man or a woman finds themselves frequently reaching for their phone, their iPad, their laptop,
Sure.
disappears to the bathroom, some other private location,
Correct.
feels drawn to watch, end of a long day. It's hard to live a religious life these days. You got to make money, pay tuition, pay the bills. You finally got the kids to sleep. You got everything done. You just need a release. You just need to relax. You just want to. Maybe you're in a marriage where you're not having intimacy with the frequency you want. Sure. And I know that I've had people say to me that they even feel heroic, that rather than have to go to their spouse and demand engaging in intimacy, they're taking care of themselves, and it's for shalom bayis, Rabbi. It's for shalom bayis. I'm not an addict. I don't have a problem. It's just something I crave. It's a natural thing. We live in a sexualized world.
Well, it means that they have a problem because they're not satisfied sexually.
Right.
So that means they do have a problem, and they're addressing it by perpetuating the behavior. They're not addressing their issue with unsatisfied sexual life.
Right. And we've talked about that in another context. Maybe we come back to that too. Okay. Is how does one approach a spouse? How do you have that conversation? What is healthy, and how do you get on the same page about that? So we got this person, and they get home, they want to relax. Some people's vices is a glass of wine, some a single malt scotch, some a cigar, some binge watch Netflix, and some people have a sexual release, and they're going to watch a little something, and they're going to act out in a way. But I think maybe you could speak to the research also shows that even in a non-religious setting, in an agnostic setting, there's a sense of not only guilt, but a sense of shame that comes after this type of behavior. Even when one's religious beliefs are not incompatible with the behavior, there's still something psychologically that creates the shame. So the person wants to change, and now they're listening, they're watching, they've tuned in. Yes. They say, I can't stand the fact that every time it happens, right afterwards, I swear to myself, to God, to my spouse, to the world, mostly to myself because I don't tell anyone else, that's the last time I'm deleting these things from my phone. I'm never going to put myself back in that situation. I'm not going to act out. I feel guilty. I feel ashamed. I feel horrible. But the next day it happens again. Yeah. Give them hope. What's the path?
So the first step is creating boundaries. And for instance, if somebody's ritual is to act out in their bathroom, the first step would be leave your cell phone outside the bathroom. Very simple, very basic, very fundamental. The second you bring your cell phone into the bathroom, you're already past that threshold of choice. Choice begins by implementing the boundaries. So what we do in the therapeutic process is we acknowledge where those consistency, usually there's some ritualization, usually there's some consistency where they're acting out, when they're acting out, how they're acting out. Once those items are identified, we go through a process of implementing boundaries around those behavioral reactions. So something as simple as leaving your cell phone outside the bathroom, whether somebody's at work and they...
Let me push you back on that one.
Okay.
I think it's fantastic advice. And I love that idea, the language of ritualization, that we behave in patterns, we're people, and even this behavior has patterns to it, and so if we could break the cycle of the pattern, identify the patterns, break the patterns, and preemptively, prophylactically try to avoid the places, the stimuli, the things that put us into those patterns. But now talk to the person who says, but I don't want to leave my cell phone outside the bathroom.
Correct.
So I feel guilty afterwards, and when I'm done, I swear I won't. But then when I'm feeling anxiety, or I'm feeling stressed out, or I've had a difficult day, or I've worked hard, or I've been stimulated and want to release, and I can't have one in a healthy way, I don't want to leave it outside the bathroom. So if it were that simple, it wouldn't be hard to diet, it wouldn't be hard to exercise, it wouldn't be hard to... We know that there are things we shouldn't be doing, but we want to do it. So where's that nexus between taking, that's the connection between the head and the heart, the tefillin of the head and the tefillin of the heart, all those divrei Torah, but not for now. How do we create that direct channel between the head and the heart?
Yeah. I mean, such is the challenge of life. I think the first step is acknowledging that we will live stressful life, and we do have challenges, and there's overwhelming, responsibilities that we all have. Acting out is not going to be a solution. It's the flawed solution. It's an attempt to solve the issue. That person building that raft to get to the other side of the river might get him to the other side of the river in the moment, but it's the way to fully and comprehensively address it is to teach himself how to swim.
Right.
And I think that that's really the most important component here, where there might be an assumption that if I continue to build rafts and I continue to carry these rafts over, then I'll survive. But ultimately, the rivers aren't stopping. So to take that energy and to shift it to a comprehensive roadmap to develop the ability to modulate their emotions.
So by the river and the roadmap, you mean the anxiety, tomorrow's going to be just as hard as today.
Absolutely.
You're still going to have bills. Your kids are still going to misbehave.
Correct.
You're still going to be maybe sexually frustrated in your bedroom. All of those things are still going to be there.
Correct.
And just like today, your acting out didn't remove them or overcome them
Correct.
or satisfy them, they're going to be back again tomorrow. So you
And
need to
very
figure
often-
out alternatives.
Correct. And very often there's an attempt to solve that by a 4-foot raft, and then a 7-foot raft, and then a 10-foot raft, which is where the addiction component comes into play, where the intensity increases and the consistency increases, the tolerance develops. There's something called the arousal template, which is really shaped by all those stimuli that come towards us. And if a person develops an arousal template that's machine enhanced, they're in trouble because they can't recreate that level of stimulation outside of the computer or outside of that interface. Research indicates what gives marketers a competitive edge online is if they're able to recreate some imagery every 250 milliseconds.
Wow.
The average blink of an eye is 400 milliseconds. So you're talking about rapid, high-level stimuli that's coming across for minutes and hours on a continuum.
And so with that insight, people have submitted questions in advance.
Sure.
We have an anonymous system. If anyone wants to submit a question, brsonline.org/anonymous. brsonline.org/anonymous. And feel free to submit a question even during this discussion. So
Can I just say
Yeah,
one item about shame, because that's a very powerful piece. Usually in the cycle of addiction and capturing that cycle and putting a wedge in that system, which is the goal of recovery, a person will notice that right after the acting out experience, there's a shame or a guilt cycle that develops. John Bradshaw, one of the leading experts in the field of addiction recovery, talks about a shame-based disorder at the core. When a person feels, shame comes in healthy shame and toxic shame. Healthy shame keeps a person grounded and stable. Toxic shame is when there's an internalized belief that they're valueless, that they're incapable, that they can't do it. Acting out is a way to perpetuate that shame-based identity. I'm going to continue to either consciously or subconsciously sabotage my relationship, sabotage my work environment by acting out because that's who I think I am. So the recovery begins when a person's willing and able to take those risks and challenge that shame-based identity. And that comes through looking yourself truthfully in the mirror as opposed to running to the escape of the online use.
Interesting. And I want to recommend here an incredible sefer. I don't think it's only in Hebrew. I haven't seen it in English, called Sichos of Rav Shlomo Hoffman. Rav Shlomo Hoffman was an amazing social worker, Talmid Chacham in Israel, and he addressed this issue of guilt and shame. He was speaking particularly to this behavior and in this area, even though he doesn't call it that name. And he brings countless traditional Torah sources that support the notion that shame and guilt actually hold us back, they paralyze us, they debilitate us, rather than propel us or drive us forward. And that as much as we are accountable for what we've done, and we have to learn from it, reflect on it, feel a certain healthy guilt about having done it, the focus is really about the future, not the past. And that even addressing these issues, rather than focus on the literature that, if one has engaged in this behavior, it's as if you murdered 1,000 souls and you have no portion of the world to come and there is no atonement you could attain for it. He brings sources that talk about the fact that we falter, we fall, we get back up. You can't change the past, you can only change the future. You start again, and the next day you make it a little better. But what you were talking about in terms of the stimuli, the eyes, and the impact on arousal, would address another question, because people have submitted questions in advance, and I want to touch on a few of them. And one person talked about that maybe pornography watching is detrimental or negative outside the context of intimacy or healthy marriage. But what if a couple want to engage in it together? And again, I want to clarify. Halacha would have no room. There's no flexibility. Halacha would be absolutely opposed. Within the halachic bedroom, there's much, within the Rambam's line, almost everything is permissible, and one should engage in pleasure and seek pleasure, and that's part of the mitzvah. But there are boundaries, and watching the pornography is not within that boundary. It's clearly outside the boundary. But from a social work standpoint or a clinical standpoint, talk about that impact. Would there ever be a scenario aside from the halacha? Would there be? Is there a negative impact of a couple?
So in my work, I have never seen it work. I've never seen a couple come forth that have healthy intimacy, that bring in external stimuli into their relationship. And the reason is very simple, because there's a lot of comparisons that's done that are made on a continuum. There's a certain, perhaps, a willingness to engage in that behavior, but that's out of desperation. That's not a proactive approach. That's not something that not either participating member really feels good about. The reason why they come to the office is because they've attempted to implement or incorporate this behavior into their relationship, and it hasn't brought them to
They come as a couple, as individuals.
Both.
What brings most people to your office?
It's usually...
Where does the person have to sink to say, I'm going to meet a sex addiction therapist?
Yeah.
Are they caught by their spouse?
I mean, most people, there's actually a feeling of relief when there's discovery. Because they know themselves that they're not happy. In fact, it's a flawed solution. So they're struggling with whatever they're struggling, which we outlined, and they continue to increase the behavior without those solutions that they're attempting to address. So the couples that I work with and the individuals that I work with, it's really an outgrowth of pain. We talk little about sex in the office. It's really about the relationship with the escape that might produce. And it's addressing all the underbelly of any compulsive behavior is all the overwhelming emotions that the person, the individual, or the coupleship is struggling with.
So, and is there a vicious cycle that the more one's exposed to the sexualized world and the more one watches these things and the more one expects them in their own marriage and the less likely that to happen, the more that one can only find them outside, and therefore that just vicious cycle of repeating that behavior, which only entrenches you in having expectations that have no bearing on reality, and therefore needing to turn back to that, which...
It's deeper than the expectation, the physical expectation. There's an attempt to develop intimacy, connection, to implement or to establish all the neurochemical shifts that take place through the orgasmic experience. And that can't happen when we introduce fantasy into reality, because it's not talking to the same system, right? A person's experience with acting out, watching pornography, it is the fantasy world. When they bring that or attempt to bring that into their bedroom, they're faced with that fantasy and they're put up against their reality. So the shame is so much more increased at that point. It's almost a realization that the fantasy is not reality. So it actually, it brings very often it brings couple further apart.
And again, I want to ask this in a tanua, in as modest a way as possible, and that's why we've created this system to try to preserve and maintain a sense of modesty. Are there things that a couple can be doing to find satisfaction in this area that would be a source of support to a husband or a wife who's struggling to find it outside? Is it a matter of being creative or open within the bedroom? Is it a matter of frequency of their intimacy?
Yeah, so that's a very individualized. That's a very individualized question. I think that there obviously there's different personality types, and they're high motivated. There's mismatched libidos, as you mentioned. That's so individualized. It's hard to address on a large scale.
So let me put the question a little bit differently. And we did a conference call a couple of years ago. I did with another therapist more on this area, but. To what degree do you connect the challenges of intimacy today with the addiction to pornography and sex addiction and the pursuit of finding satisfaction outside? And I think that even within the Orthodox or the observant Torah community, it's all over the world, is that living you can't drive, in our community, you can't drive down I-95 without seeing very explicit billboards, if not in pictures, but in words. An air conditioning company has the most phenomenal slogan, but of course it's drawing on, and marketing has forever drawn on that type of imagery. So even the most pious, the most vigilant man or woman who goes to work today, or who sees advertising, who has magazines, who's not trying to look at explicit material, but has a strong drive. And we're also living in an anxiety-driven world where people have tremendous stress, tremendous pressure, and I see, it's historically always been that within marriage, what are the three things that people fight about? Money, family, and sex, and not necessarily in that order, depends. So when a couple is struggling with intimacy, mismatched libidos, mismatched expectations, mismatched background and experience, or drive, to what degree do you think that by not tackling and not solving that issue, and in my experience in counseling couples as a rabbi, I found that one of the biggest issues is that couples aren't communicating. So that you'll have a woman who doesn't feel pretty, so she's not engaging intimacy with her husband. Her husband's not saying things to make her feel beautiful, nor is he saying that there's a consequence of our not having intimacy because I have a drive that needs a release elsewhere, and the failure to communicate something that could have been solved early on ends up escalating and becoming a big problem. So that's a long-winded way of asking the question, to what degree is there an association between not tackling or confronting the challenges of intimacy within a healthy marriage and therefore bringing people to act out?
I'm happy you asked that, because research indicates, and we've seen in doing this work, that very often once there's disclosure, once there's honesty that's introduced into the relationship, the coupleship always gets closer. and you talked about communicating about this issue. If a man or a woman is struggling, the recommendation is to get honest, to be honest. There might be pain and anger initially, but over the long haul, you're dealing with an honest person. And that is the bedrock that intimacy is developed on. So just to respond to your question, when bringing the secrecy and keeping the secrecy and the double life outside of the relationship, what it does is it prevents the coupleship from getting closer. And of course that translates into an enjoyable sexual experience because there's all the other stuff that a person's carrying to that, to the table there. And that's really, the first step is to get honest. And, there's a structure in how to disclose, when to disclose, where to disclose. There needs to be support on both sides. But the couples that do, and this is, really, nationally the studies, really highlight this point that the actual research is north of 90% of disclosures, when done right, do not lead to divorce. They lead to healthier, more grounded relationships.
Disclosure meaning sharing, being transparent. That
correct. If there's infidelity, if there's been secrecy, if there's been acting out on any level, because for the first time a spouse starts to identify that my husband's being honest with me.
Right.
And there are so many indicators that take place historically in the relationship that don't sit right. And the woman starts to understand, or the man starts to see, oh, this is what this was about. So for the first time, there's honesty. And the courtship needs to develop after that honesty has been established. So it's definitely a process. It's a grueling one, but it's doable, and we've seen success multiple times on many levels.
And a few points to support that. First of all, the Torah calls intimacy or sexuality das. Adam yadas chava ishto. So the notion of intimacy is not just a physical connection, but it is giving someone else access to you, exposure to you, knowledge of you in a way that no one else knows. And the more you share it, the more people have access to it, the less personal, less intimate, the less of a connection it is. So when you say that when a person has disclosure, they're transparent, they share what's going on in the inner recesses of their heart, or behavior that someone thinks is shameful, that's the first step towards healing, because you're contributing to a sense of da'as, to a sense of knowledge.
And I would just encourage, if you're struggling on any level, take the risk, put your feet in the water, reach out to your rabbi, reach out to a therapist, but take the steps to start this process, because the lack of intimacy that you experience is not a lack of sexuality. It really is the fear that's keeping people back.
There's an amazing therapist, Esther Perel. She has a TED Talk where she talks about recovering from infidelity, and it's also, I think, worthwhile to watch, because she also talks about that infidelity doesn't mean the end of your marriage. Infidelity can be, fully all the way. Infidelity could be an emotional affair. Infidelity could be when there's, again, religious tension that one discovers their spouse is watching things, which the secular world would not call that infidelity, that you watched something inappropriate, but within our world that could be an act of disloyalty or of infidelity. But that doesn't mean the end of a relationship. If it's addressed properly, you can actually uncover, address, repair, and have a healthier marriage than you ever had beforehand. So a person shouldn't give up hope.
Yeah, Rob Weiss, one of the leading experts, again, I'm actually on a conference call with him tomorrow. They're in the process of developing an inpatient rehabilitation facility focused just on compulsive sexual behaviors. It's amazing where we're at in this world at this point, because it's here and it's here to stay. But he talks about the definition of infidelity as keeping meaningful secrets from your primary romantic partner. Keeping a meaningful secret from your primary romantic partner. That is the definition of infidelity, because it's a mistrust. And a person comes home with that mistrust, that when a spouse or a partner finds out about it, they're going to feel betrayed. And that betrayal is the first step to toxicity that prevents the coupleship from building the intimacy.
So let's pursue this, though, because this is an important question, and there's a lot of questions pouring in here, and I hope we're going to have a time to get to some of them. But let's talk about that, because that notion of giving the other person full knowledge of you, access to your life, that's nice in theory, but let's play that out now. You've got an observant Torah personality husband talking to his observant Torah personality wife, and I know that those language just included a lot of assumptions. But let's assume that they both have religious backgrounds and they're at a place of religious commitment. Doesn't the man worry about, he tells his wife, I just want you to know that I have a very active libido. When I go to work, my eyes are drawn to see women who are in various states of undress. My mind races to the things I think and fantasize I want to do with them. I struggle every time I'm near technology to watch things I shouldn't. I struggle to act out when I'm in private and I have the opportunity. And honey, I have it all under control right now.
Sure.
But I want you to know everything about me. So I finished Ksubas and Baba Kama and made a siyum. I learned the daf. I go to the 7 o'clock minyan. And you should also know that as a healthy man, I struggle with this. Or the equivalent of a woman who tells her husband, I want you to know we have a healthy, intimate life. Things are good. I'm religiously stable. I'm a good mom and a good wife. You should just know I have fantasies. I have desires. I have thoughts. I read novels. I watch movies. Even not explicit, forget pornography, but romantic novels and romantic movies, and really very different than I think the way we grew up, or recent times. Even regular TV is soft pornography, or certainly cable TV these days, the shows that even religious personalities share at the water cooler that they've watched on Monday morning the night before are soft pornography. So is it really a safe space for a man to tell his wife? Doesn't he have to worry about her reaction, or for a woman to tell her husband?
Sure. So that's a good point. I think it really circles back to what we mentioned before. It's when there's pathology associated with the behavior. So when the consequences develop, if a person can't function at work because he's distracted by the fantasy that he's struggling with, because what will happen is the person will come home and he'll be disengaged with his wife, and his wife will see those cues and be curious internally what's going on.
Right.
So the failure to disclose, right, will prevent her from securely attaching, or prevent him from securely attaching. So
might it also prevent her from letting him out of the house ever again?
Correct.
Doesn't she say, well, you got to quit your job,
right,
you can never leave this house, hand in all your technology, because that scares the life out of me. Or a healthy husband would hear that from his wife. You should know I read these novels, I have some fantasies, I'm not acting out, all is good. Wouldn't it create fear?
Right, so I think it's not about a fleeting a fantasy or something, or a trigger when you saw driving on the highway somewhere. I think when there's an unhealthy relationship with that, if there's a preoccupation, the person comes home and she's like, "What's wrong, honey?" And he's like, "Oh, nothing." And what he's thinking about is the fantasy of what he's been thinking about the whole day, or he's preoccupying because he knows that she'll be leaving for the night, so he has a couple hours to act out. And she's like, "Honey, what's wrong? We're not connected."
The lights on, no one's home.
Correct. That's when disclosure needs to take place.
So
obviously
model for
under
us,
the structure,
what
because
it's
going to be the discovery is going to be a true discovery where now I understand that you're struggling with something, and there might be pain initially and there might be anger initially, but for the first time in their coupleship there'll be honesty.
So model what this looks like: a husband or a wife who need to disclose to the other.
Sure.
Or, and I don't know if we want to take this detour right now, but there are single men and single women who are acting compulsively and engaging or acting out, and are they going to disclose to a friend, to a therapist, to the rabbi? Someone who's listening, somebody's watching, they have this courage. What does it look like? What are the words? Give them some language to approach their spouse in a way that's not going to scare them to death, make them run out of the room.
Well, this is the risk of recovery on all levels. I mean, it is scary, it's overwhelming. I'm privileged to speak and hear courageous stories from people all day. That takes real ego strength. It takes either a person feeling desperate enough to disclose, or a person being willing enough to understand that there's hope in their life. And I think that's the paradox of mental health, and that's the paradox of recovery. There's they actually call it there was an admiral in one of the wars, Admiral Jim Scottsdale. He was a leader of men, and he was held in the DP camps for over 8 years. And he talked about the paradox of understanding his reality, of living with rationed food and being tortured, but yet dreaming and thinking about the American cigarette and his loved ones back at home. And that dichotomy, the ability to look honestly at a person's life today, but also recognize that if they go through the process of recovery, they're going to ultimately facilitate healthy intimacy and secure attachment by taking those risks.
Right. And
that's the challenge that we all struggle with on many levels.
Right, and one of the questions that was submitted is, and let's say someone's disclosing, don't they have to worry that their spouse is going to say, am I not good enough for you? Are you not attracted to me? You have to watch those things, do those things, you're struggling with that, am I not there for you?
Yeah,
How does that impact marriage?
That's a great question, and therefore I think it's critical to mention that disclosure without structure is a death sentence. I think that there needs to be support developed for him. I think there needs to be comprehensive support developed for her or for the betrayed spouse. And once there's a structure in place, through therapeutic or through rabbinic guidance, there can be a platform to really facilitate honesty, and then the courtship can develop, because until that happens, the secrecy will end up sabotaging the relationship.
So you're saying disclosure of this urge, this drive, this challenge in a healthy context, in a healthy format, in a healthy way, not only won't sabotage the relationship, it can really actually heal it and bring it to a great place.
Absolutely.
I do want to interrupt to point out, as I'm sure many know, there's an amazing resource for people who are struggling in this area, and frankly, even if you're not struggling. I think that if you're a healthy male, maybe if you're a healthy female, and you're alive today, you're by definition struggling because, Shmiras Einayim, it's a struggle. It's a struggle to eat right, it's a struggle not to say the wrong things, it's a struggle to have kavanah when you daven, and it's a struggle not to look at imagery you shouldn't. If a person is healthy, they're struggling not to look at that. So there's an amazing website, guideyoureyes.com, heroic work of Rabbi Dr. Twersky and others. Guideyoureyes.com has all kinds of literature, support groups, daily emails, and materials that are really valuable. So
there's another resource out there. It's called sexhelp.com. There's actually an intake that you can do online, completely confidential. It's the SAST. It's a survey and a questionnaire to answer privately, and you get a full comprehensive report to see if you are struggling on that level. There's dozens of resources, access to Therapeutic, to podcasts, to information. Sexhelp.com. I would encourage everyone who feels that they're struggling or might be struggling to go through and explore that as well.
So how would you answer this question that just came in? I'm not going to read it literally for reasons that may be obvious in a moment. My wife doesn't do a certain explicit act. Of course I'm going to watch it. And yes, I know that's crazy because it's just going to make me want to do it more, but I know Allah permits that act. And why do I need to be deprived? I gave up 3 billion women for her, and I expect and am entitled to a great sex life.
So that's a great question. Thank you for the courage of asking it. And
it was asked anonymously, as all the questions are.
Correct.
Also takes courage anyway, but...
I think the first step is communication. I think that there needs to be a platform for a coupleship to talk. I would respond to that question as the first level of sharing that with your spouse and asking her, discussing it, because without communication, that fantasy will continue to make that person crazy. So really, in a quiet, peaceful way, introduce the topic. And that's really, I think, you and I have spoken about one of the hopes of this is to really launch a dialogue.
Right.
The specifics of that is individual. It's individualized to that individual, to his spouse, to their relationship, to what's been going on historically in their relationship, to what his exposure has been. There's so many layers to every specific question. But talk about it. Open up that conversation. Create the safety and the freedom of discussion. It's a very powerful tool. It's simple, it's free, and it needs to be implemented because it's going to be the first step towards building that healthy intimacy.
Chazal, our rabbis, had an amazing insight in this area. The Gemara says that the drive for sex is the only drive that man has where the more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. Yeah. Right? If you're starving for food, if you love sushi and you eat sushi for a week, you never want to see sushi again for a while. Right? When you feel full, you're not hungry again. Mm-hmm. And this is an appetite that the more you feed it, the hungrier it becomes. And I would answer that anonymous question also by saying that it's not like you're watching that or you're going to somehow fulfill or get it out of your system and then you could move on to get back to healthy intimacy. Yeah. The more you watch it, the more you crave it, the less you have it, the more you think you deserve it. Yeah. It's not going to end up in something good. So, and the truth is that we all also need to look in the mirror. To be mature in life is to realize that there are limits on everything we have. Maybe we dreamt of a certain house, a certain car. Maybe our spouse dreamt of a person who didn't lose their hair or develop a gut. Yeah. In other words, part of marriage is accepting that there are boundaries and we don't all have the same tastes in food and music and life and in the bedroom. And so, yes, there's certain things that we deserve and that are basic. They take the communication, they take working out, they take effort, they take negotiation, they take selflessness. Mm-hmm. But there are explicit acts or certain specific acts which maybe your marriage doesn't include. And if that's your challenge in life, then that's the one that person has to have.
But acting out on it definitely won't facilitate that need. It won't pacify that hunger.
So let's change directions because someone just submitted a question which I think is really important, and this could go on for hours. And if it's positive, if we get good feedback from it, then maybe we'll do this again if it's of value to people. Not that this is how you're known because it is your. This is not how I want to be known. I just want to start a conversation that I think needs to happen. I know needs to happen. So someone submitted the following. Interesting how this plays out in a married couple. How about for those who are not married? Being the Orthodox frowns on is is repressive about any form of physical contact with the opposite sex, so there's no room for many people for any benefit of mutually beneficial touch, even without sex. So in other words, what would you say to somebody, a man or a woman who's not married, who does not have a halachically permissible outlet? Is it realistic? Is it realistic for a teenage boy, but certainly is it realistic for a man in his 20s or 30s or 40s, whatever life circumstances that he is alone? He has no outlet. There's no paspasala. There's no intimacy in a married life. He just needs to communicate more. Is it really realistic to say he's going to be abstinent from watching the wrong things or from acting out?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if a person has a certain value system that he starts to go against, the shame that we talked about is going to start to develop as well. As far as what's permissible, what's not permissible, I mean, there are people that, desire, as you mentioned, a bigger house. Does that mean that they can go ahead and steal that house? As far as, what is allowed, what's not allowed, I defer to the rabbinic authority. I can tell you one thing. There's a book written, it's called Your Brain on Porn, and really talks about what happens when there's the fantasy and what happens when there's that compulsive behavior. I've worked with young men in their 30s who present with what's called PIED, which is porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And it's a medical manifestation of overstimuli, ostensibly. And, there's boundaries that need to be implemented. It's not necessarily a religious thing. There are boundaries that need to be implemented across the board. When a person develops what we call arousal template that's unmatched in reality, they're going to start to feel depressed and lonely once they start developing a relationship, because it's all fantasy based. It's not reality based. My clientele is not necessarily only Jewish or Orthodox. It's open to the public, and it's the same presentation. We see the same issues across the board.
Right. So how would that single individual? He's just being told, hold out till you're married.
Sure.
You'll be able to get there.
Yeah.
And where does he find the strength? Where does he find the outlet?
I mean,
just to play devil's advocate again.
Sure.
I know what the Torah's expectation is, and if Hashem demands it, then we all have the capacity for it. That's a fundamental belief that we have. But just to play the devil's advocate, certainly the secular world would say that that's not normal. That's not healthy. So maybe when you live in a back shtetl
the secular world is challenging that. I mean, I think that's the reality. I mean, video game addiction is here to stay. Pornography addiction is here to stay, and it's a macro level issue. I mean, it's an economic challenge. It's a human developmental challenge. It's a social challenge. I don't think it's a religious issue. I think that a compulsive behavior that's an escape will be an issue for that individual.
Okay, so you believe that there is a path for the individual, single, married, anyone who's struggling, who says, I'm doing things that go against my beliefs, religious or otherwise, has the ability to stop doing them.
Sure.
Whether it's from eating unhealthy foods or smoking
Absolutely.
cigarettes or drinking alcohol or acting out sexually.
Correct. It's an addiction. It takes on the neurochemistry of an addiction. It takes on the behavioral manifestations of an addiction. And if it does go against the person's value system, or if it is pathological in the sense of inability to stop or increased need, whether it's intensity or volume, everything we just outlined, then that person is going to become addicted to that, and he needs a recovery in order to establish a healthy modulation between the behavior and himself.
Right. Another question that came in, and I know we're all over the place a little bit, and that's okay. And hopefully that keeps the conversation interesting. We're touching on everything in a very shallow way. We're not going deep on anything, but we're covering a lot of topics. When you recommend abstinence, going cold turkey, suppose someone is still fantasizing, is that considered abstinence? Is it a stepping stone? Is it neither? So they're not watching, they're not acting out, but they're still find their mind racing, they're distracted, I guess, within the context of their marriage or outside of it. Where does fantasy come in?
Yeah, so fantasy is probably the most powerful.
Avera.
Correct. And fantasy is one of the most powerful consequences of somebody who's addicted to this issue. Because it's the fantasy that drives the behavior, and it's the fantasy that distracts from being productive. A very practical solution to that is the 12-step work. There's group dynamic, there's essay meetings. I would encourage that person to share that in a group setting. What it does is it creates a safety for that person, and it creates a certain bond
to share what? That they're still fantasizing, their mind is racing?
Just relieving that information in and of itself takes away the fear of that. Fantasy is probably the most powerful piece. It's the relationship with the behavior that keeps a person in it.
Is there any role for fantasy? I mean,
sure, in a healthy way, absolutely. Fantasy is one of the most creative expressions of sexuality.
So talk about that for a moment.
I mean, in a healthy paradigm, a person needs to incorporate all the stimuli that comes across through fantasy. Whether that's within the permissible guidelines, there's room for that needs to take place. We encourage fantasy, flirting. I mean, healthy sexuality is really the result of recovery from this behavior. Unhealthy fantasy, preoccupation, is what causes a person to stay stuck in that cycle that we outlined.
So fantasy in the sense of a longing for a spouse,
Sure.
whether it's longing even in one's own mind with their own imagery, whether it's expressing that longing to the spouse, whether it's fantasizing of things one wants to do with their spouse. In the healthy context, that's constructive.
Sure.
But outside of that context, if it's fantasizing about other people, that's compulsive behavior, which is destructive.
Correct, or whatever that fantasy, if it's unhealthy, if it's causing consequences. Like if somebody's overwhelmed at school and they decide to just check out and fantasize, then they're not addressing the fact that they're overwhelmed by school.
Right. It's interesting when we speak about fantasy and the role of thought. Again, just to quote Chazal, our rabbis, they saw in some ways, Hirhur Avera is worse than Avera. When one thinks about, fantasizes about doing the wrong thing, it's worse than doing the wrong thing, because when you do the wrong thing in the heat of passion in that moment, when your drive pushes you towards it, you're still accountable, but it's understandable. But when you allow yourself to meditate, when you allow yourself to fantasize in some way that's worse. I just want to interject.
Sure.
Rav Shlomo Aviner, the Rav of Beit El, the Rosh Hashiva of Ater Kohanim, has a wonderful book that he wrote. It's been translated into English. Its name escapes me at the moment. It was written towards young yeshiva boys or Bnei Akiva boys in Israel about how to overcome this compulsive desire to watch and to acting out. And in there he quotes a great Kabbalistic source, an ancient Makubal, who has a fantastic tradition. I'm curious what your response is to this as a strategy. For me, I found it very powerful, not only in this arena but in others, and I've shared it with other people. This Kabbalah Sefer, he tells the story of a chassid who comes to his Rebbe's home. One night, he's struggling. He's fantasizing. He's got problems with Hirur Avera. He's thinking about women. He's got anxiety about Parnasa, about his livelihood. His mind is racing, is running, and it's causing all kinds of problems. So he runs to his Rebbe, to his rabbi's home, and he knocks on the door, and no one answers. So he bangs louder on the door, and nobody answers. And he goes around to the side of the house, and he looks and he sees the rabbi sitting at the table studying. So he knocks on the window. The rabbi doesn't even look up. So dejected and despondent, he goes home. The next morning after davening, after the prayers, he comes up to the rabbi and he says, Rebbe, last night I had a major problem and I needed you. And the Rebbe said, I know what your problem is, and I already gave you the answer. He looked at him. You didn't let me in. How do you know my problem is? How'd you give me the answer? The rabbi looked at him and he said, the same way that you knocked on my door, but I had the choice whether to let you in or not. When the thoughts come and they knock, they're entitled to knock. You own whether to let them in or not. You are the one who can choose to let them in or not. And this Kabbalistic Sefer that Rav Aviner quote says that halachically, God doesn't hold us accountable for the thoughts that knock. Okay. You see an image, there's a moment of weakness, you have a thought that comes and it knocks, you're not accountable that something drew your attention, the thought knocked. We're accountable when we let it in. We're accountable when we let it stay, when we let it take up room and board, when we set aside some real estate for it. When we let the thought in and we marinate in the thought, that's when we're accountable. So, and he suggests that, Rav Aviner, and I'm curious your reaction to that, as one of the strategies is to realize that these thoughts are going to arise. If you're alive, if you're healthy, the thoughts are going to arrive. Sure. We interact in the world, we see people. But one of the ways is to realize that just because the thought came doesn't mean I have to let it in. I can redirect, I can rechannel, I can choose to think about something else, I can shut that thought out.
So in recovery, in essay, we talk about the 3-second rule. And what it is if there's a stimuli, a visual stimuli or an emotional stimuli, to embrace that thought, accept it, and then let it go. So it's the same process. It's a meditative tool. There's various different therapies that a person can learn and can implement to help them with allowing that information to come and then to move on past it. Very similar in structure.
Yeah. If people, we're going to keep talking because I think this is helpful. But if people have to go, it's going to be recorded and we'll find a way that people can access it later. And also I want to remind you again, if you want to submit an anonymous question, brsonline.org/anonymous. So another question that was just submitted. In order for couples to heal after this challenge, betrayal, where one spouse engaged in pornography, which in itself is fascinating, again, right, in the secular world, one spouse engaging in pornography would probably not be labeled a betrayal or an act of infidelity. Again, probably the more religious background you have, the more it is.
Yes and no. You have betrayal that shows up in the same level because there's a certain trust. There's a certain trust that a person won't be acting out, won't be watching pornography.
Or anything that goes against the assumption in the marriage is an act of betrayal.
Correct.
So the person wanted to know, would you say that they need therapy separate and or together in order to truly get past it?
Right.
So there's a betrayal, someone's been watching porn, the other discovered, can he say, you know what, you're right, I want it to stop anyway, I got it, I'm good?
Yeah.
Or would you suggest that this is a couple that separately or together need therapy?
I mean, I think it really very much depends on, how the individuals feel about that. Do they feel that it's a one-time occurrence? Does the woman trust that her husband just slipped and it wasn't a betrayal? There's no secrecy. I mean, it's so individualized how they each process that experience of discovery.
Right.
I mean, patterns, also historical patterns of behaviors are something to look at as well. Is there secrecy around computer use? Is there scheduling conflict or confusion around other items in their world?
Right.
That's something to explore. Yeah.
If I know this is an indirect question, but it's come to me.
Okay.
If a woman finds her husband has no interest in sex, or a man finds his wife has no interest, not mismatched libidos of frequency, but literally feel withdrawn and no interest,
Yeah.
is that an indication?
That's a
of
very
something
common
more?
indicator, actually.
Yeah. So I've said to a woman who comes and says, my husband has absolutely no interest, I initiate, I try to do things that are seductive, and he has no interest.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that, whether it's an issue of homosexuality, of an affair, or of a pornography addiction, not necessarily. There are some men who are just stressed out, anxious, or who have other physiological challenges. But is that an indicator?
I would say that's a very strong indicator, and very often it talks to the core of the challenge because it is an intimacy failure. It's an inability to bond with the other, which was what drives a person acting out sexually. If you think about what it is on a behavioral level, right? It's intrusive. It's the fantasy, the stimulation is all about the desire to connect. And very often there's a fear to connect, and it's safer. There's a certain control. A person has the power to turn on and turn off. But when they're in front of a person, when they're with their spouse, they don't have that flexibility. So they're paralyzed by it, which is why they avoid it. So that's a very common presentation that we see.
Interesting. So it's something for people to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
Although that comes back to what we've been discussing, is it really comes down to communication.
Correct.
Right? It comes down to saying, hey, what's going on over here? Intimacy is a really important part of a healthy marriage. It's a natural and legitimate desire. Why aren't you engaged in it? We need to address that.
Yeah.
You need to either see a doctor. It's like, what do I need to do in order to create some desire and compatibility? And that might open the conversation to the other person being able to.
And there's fear to avoid that conversation. And again, we've seen research indicates when the coupleship takes those risks, they both appreciate it, and they're stronger because of it. So I would encourage everyone to take that risk. Again, it's not necessarily done by yourself, but with the structure or the guidance of some professional, a clinician, or a rabbi. It's really important, and it's ultimately going to help bring the coupleship closer.
Another question that was submitted. If you find out a male religious member, and it doesn't have to be male, but if you find out a family member is engaging heavily in pornography, has downloaded hookup apps, how do you approach them in an effective way, assuming approaching is wise at all? It's not a spouse, but a close family member.
Yeah.
So you suspect, I guess, it's a sibling, it's a nephew, it's a
Sure.
niece, it could be a friend. You could say all the things that you say were indicators. The light's on, no one's home, they seem distracted, they're always engaged in private behavior, they have marathon sessions on their computer, and you want to finally engage them. It's almost doing an intervention on them.
Sure.
Who should do it? What do you say? What's the most effective? And what are the next steps?
So I think the first step is outlining the hope. And I think that if a person has a certain relationship with that individual is coming out of love and out of care and out of concern, they should confront that person. Most times people are waiting for that confrontation. It's a relief. When they get busted, people want to be caught because they're overwhelmed. Again, it's an attempt to solve an issue that's not being solved. So by sharing with them that there's a roadmap, that there's a way out, and helping them get to that way out through the confrontation process and holding them accountable on following those recommendations, you're saving that person from a lot of pain. So I would encourage everyone to confront.
Good. Now, talk to me about how you confront.
The first step is, again, it's detailed oriented depending on what the behavior is. But if it's access use, to implement some boundaries, to confront the person, saying, I noticed that you're online a lot, or I noticed that you're disengaged at the dinner table, or how are you doing with your intimacy? I mean, there's dozens of people that have shared with me on a kind of daily basis, what they should do and how can they empower that person to get the help that they need. So it's individuals, it's circumstantial, but people are waiting for it.
The person who's struggling with it
is waiting for it, absolutely.
Knows it's coming and will find it to be
correct,
unburdening when it comes. Okay.
It's the heavy load of addiction. It's that secrecy that a person carries all throughout their life. It's the double life. I mean, it's all of this stuff that, at the core, when they look themselves in the mirror, they're not solving the issue. They're not dealing with what's causing them anxiety, the fears that they're living with, the trauma, the sexual trauma that they experience. All of that stuff is not being resolved. They're attempting to resolve it. So by giving them a roadmap to resolve it, they're going to run to it.
So again, I want to almost come full circle to the way we began, because I want to just clarify this, and I'm playing the devil's advocate. But what would you say to the person who says, look, I function normally, I'm not distracted, I do well at work, I'm engaged in my relationships, I have healthy intimacy in my bedroom, but the fact that I think about sex
then that's
all
not
day
an addiction.
long,
I would say
it's
very
just
clearly.
naturally, men have been doing that since creation itself.
If
It's
it's
a
not-
drive in men.
So then, if it's not causing any consequences, if there's not an increase of behavior, if it's not attempts to stop, then it's not an addiction.
So
Then there's nothing wrong with it clinically.
there's nothing wrong with it clinically, and from the clinical standpoint, it's not an addiction. But if you are somebody who is spiritually
If you're concerned about it,
aspirational-
then I would explore why are you concerned. Does it go against your value system? Are you okay with it? Are you holding it a secret from your primary partner? Do you want your kids to know about it? If you're concerned about it, there's a reason for it. You're probably struggling with some level of consequence.
Right. Okay, there's a lot of questions coming in. Is it reasonable to expect a healthy man to not watch porn if he has unprotected internet access? Which leads us to a whole other area, which is the use of technology, our children,
Yeah.
what we're bringing into our homes. And I don't share this from a religious or prudish standpoint,
Yeah.
but I referred to it earlier, is that when parents even sit with their children watching some of the more explicit television shows and movies and themes, what's that impact on their expectations, their identity,
Absolutely.
their function,
Sure.
and so on?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's a cultural norm. And really creating safety in our homes is our responsibility for our children. It's a responsibility for our spouse to keep that safety, to build barriers. The details of the barriers, there are phone filters, there are times of usage. I mean, it's endless. It's not about policing a person's behavior for tonight.
Right.
But there are means that a person can implement to ensure that there are, again, open the conversation. Sit down with your husband, sit down with your wife. What is our policy in our home when it comes to internet use? Do we have a policy? What are some things that we want to do in order to ensure that there's not overuse or there's not overexposure? Accidental exposure is huge. I mean, you have kids that have been exposed accidentally because they have open access to the internet. It's dangerous, and it causes real trauma in their worlds, and it shapes their shapes their arousal template, which causes consequences further down the road as well.
One of the questions that was submitted is are the negative impacts of pornography equal on women as they are to men? Again, halacha does distinguish between gender in some of these areas of acting out.
Sure, female acting out is slightly different. It's more relationship-based. As far as the consequences, they're the same, because the woman is going to feel lonely in her relationship. If she's going to start attaching to the fantasy and be disappointed by her reality, she's going to be preoccupied with the hope or the fantasy of what she's seen or she's exposed to. So the consequences are exactly the same. They mirror each other. The way they act out is slightly different.
Somebody submitted that the therapist, that's you,
Okay.
Moshe Yachnes, the one and only, keeps talking about it all comes down to a need to connect. I don't feel a need to connect. I don't have an emotional need that is unmet. I'm not addicted, but I do feel a physical urge. The relationship talk is not addressing my issue. So this person is describing it's not a need to connect. It's nothing to do with emotional. It's nothing to do with conversation, relationship, intimacy. It is a purely
Is it compulsive?
carnal.
Correct. And
He I assume could be she, doesn't identify with this notion about connection, need to connect, unmet need to connect, unhealthy connection.
Okay.
So what would you say to them?
A compulsive behavior is driven by an emotional void, period. So it might not be an inability to connect, it might be a sexual trauma.
Would you say about food?
It might
If
be.
I love potato chips and I eat a bag every day and I hate
and
myself
there are
every time I do,
then yeah, absolutely.
that's
because
a compulsive behavior.
it's a soothing mechanism. That means you're trying to self-soothe for a certain reason. Again, if you're okay eating a bag of potato chips every day, you can afford it physically, and your wife's not yelling at you for doing it, then by all means, it's not that there's no pathology in that. There's nothing wrong with sex, but it's the relationship with sex. So if you're okay with your behaviors, then there's no problem.
Right.
But usually, 99% of the time, it's an attempt to fill a void. It's a flawed solution.
Okay, so here's a practical question for you, and coming back to some of the methodology, because we began, and
Sure.
my ADD led us on a wild goose chase, a detour. So a man travels a lot for business,
Yeah.
and he knows that when he's away, again, there's no unmet need to connect. There's no inability to get to work the next day
Sure.
or get his job done. He may sit in his hotel room and right after finishing learning the Daf Yomi.
Sure.
But he's alone. He's been away for a week. He has no physical outlet or release. And so he finds that he regularly ends up going someplace that he regrets and feels guilty about everywhere. Give him some optimism,
yeah.
some positive. So part of it you started talking about was routine. That if
Yeah.
you know when you go to the hotel room, that when you open your iPad, when you watch a certain channel, when you
Correct.
get the free internet connection, that's when you
Correct.
set up a routine
So it's
before you get
it's
there.
implementing concrete boundaries, perhaps bookending your trip, sharing this struggle with a friend or somebody that won't judge you, a therapist, a rabbi, and have that person hold you accountable. That in of itself, implementing some structure in the boundaries level is very helpful. It's practical, it's implementable, but once you're sitting in the hotel room by yourself with internet access, that in of itself will start that cycle of addiction. That'll start the preoccupation, start the ritualization. So to avoid it, a person is required. I mean, I personally, when I go home, I have a small dinner break with my kids. I don't want to be distracted. I leave my cell phone in my car, actually. I go back home. I go back to work in the evenings, but for that hour and a half or whatever, then I'm home for dinner. I actually leave my cell phone in the car, and that's a boundary. It's very simple. It's elementary, but I know myself that if I have my cell phone on me, it's going to buzz. I'm going to be hearing about my child's day or eating supper, and I'm going to be distracted. Even if I don't pick up my phone, my mind's going to go to my phone. So it's very practical. It's implementing healthy boundaries. Once a person can analyze their story and identify their triggers, putting some space between those triggers and the behavior is what the recommendation is.
So it's really, that's it. It's figuring out the routines. It's figuring out
Correct.
when you would normally engage in that, what leads to that.
Correct.
Come back to my potato chip analogy.
Yes.
I know that when I get home at 11, 12 o'clock at night, and I'm not even hungry necessarily, but I'm relaxed the end of the day, I all of a sudden get this appetite, and I know that if that potato chips is there, if I have an alternative, if I have some fruit or baby carrots, I can fill that need elsewhere. So the similar, you go on a business trip, know what brings you down, and try to set up the boundaries to avoid that.
And if you don't buy your baby carrots, you don't put it on the top shelf, then you're going to end up going for the chips.
Right.
So you could the place of choice is not going to be when you're going home, when you're getting home at the end of a long workday.
Right.
The place of choice is going to be how to stock your cabinets.
Right, and I love that analogy about the place of choice being before you get there. And this too, as with everything that we're talking about, the rabbis really had it right, because that's the whole, the rabbis deraisa, but the whole institution of yichud. The idea that don't think that you could be alone in a room with someone that you shouldn't be alone with, and you will not, you have to make the choice not to put yourself in the place where you've already forfeited the choice.
Correct.
Which is something that's really important.
Yeah.
You have any statistics? Can you give us a sense of how many people
Sure.
really are struggling with this? Because
Yeah.
I think that there are a lot of very naive people out there, particularly within the religious community, who just assume, what do you mean? That's them, that's out there, that's not us. So even within the religious community, within our children, within our world, within the world at large.
I'm going to start on a macro level. Forbes put out an article in January of 2018. They analyzed one of the major pornography organizations. They crunched their numbers in 2017. And their statistics were as follows. There are 81 million visits per day. Okay, that's 28.5 billion annually. There's more than 50,000 searches per minute. So if you take that level of information and you put it in the Library of Congress, you're looking at 50 million books.
Wow.
Okay, so that's the magnitude that we're dealing with. Every second, in the U.S. alone, there's been over $16 billion spent on this industry. That's lost income. That's people spending money on acting out behaviors, variations, online, phone chats, paying for various different activities, and so on. $16 billion spent in 2017. There is over, every second, there are over 28,000 users are watching pornography on the internet. And this is just one company.
Every second over how many?
Every second, 28,000, over 28,000 users every second.
Wow.
Over $3,000 being spent every second.
Wow.
Okay, there's a national study developed by Forbes analyzing one of the most public and pornography institutions. You know, Dr. Patrick Carnes talks about the 3 A's of acting out. You have access to porn on your cell phone, so the affordability, the anonymity, and the accessibility. You could be by yourself, no one knows about it, it's free, and it's accessible on your smartphone. So those are the 3 indicators where you compare it to a cocaine addiction. There's a cost associated with it, there's a danger associated with it. Pornography is right there, it's in our face. I mean, every home has a computer, right? There are more tablets being circulated than there are toilets in the world.
Wow.
There's a recent study that indicated that as well. So, I mean, it's hitting us on an economic level, it's hitting us on a developmental level, and on a social level as well.
I'll just point out for those in the Boca area, we have Rabbi Avi Meth. We hosted Rabbi Pesach Cohen a couple weeks ago on this topic, and he's setting up in Boca Raton Synagogue on Sunday evenings, the
21st and
the 21st and
the 4th.
and the 4th, and he'll be available. People can bring in their devices or their children's devices and help them set them up with filters, technology. That's not, and it's really important to point this out, that's not fanatic behavior, it's not a community going to the right, it's not prudish, it's not religious extremism, it's just smart. It's just smart. It's what the secular world is also, and research is now concluding is smart, because it's unfair to put that stumbling block in front of our children. Most of us didn't grow up with cable TV, with pornography channels in our bedroom, and if you let your child have access to technology with no filter, you're bringing all of that into their bedroom.
I just want to read a quote from again, Forbes magazine. This was in December 2016, right after the presidential election, and really analyzed the usage of social media and how President Trump won the election based on it was Jared Kushner's brainstorm or association with how he kind of championed Donald Trump's message through the use of social media. And the quote is as follows: "Using Facebook and micro-targeting synced with Trump's simple message, it worked. Soon the data operation dictated every campaign decision: travel, fundraising, advertising, rally locations, even topics of the speeches. Traditional TV and online advertising is out. Twitter, Facebook would fuel the campaign." Donald Trump was able to raise over $250 million in the last 4 months of his campaign using social media. So Americans are interacting, develop almost a love affair with their devices, and that they're reaching into their pockets and taking out
more
money.
intimacy with their device than there is with their spouse.
Correct.
We're going to go a little bit longer. I know it's getting late, so we're not going to go that much longer.
Sure.
But I do want to point out...
It's an hourly rate, right, Rabbi?
It's an hourly rate. That's right. Just send the bill to our anonymous... exactly. Somebody pointed out that Guard Your Eyes has a hotline for women who've just discovered that their spouse has a problem, which sounds a little biased, but could be for any spouse who finds their spouse has a problem. The number is 646-600-8100. 646-600-8100. And it also sponsors a porn addiction group, and as I said before, is a really great resource.
There's free resources out there. Go online. There's essay meetings. There's COSA meetings. There's information. There are books. I would recommend Rob Weiss wrote a book, Sex Addiction 101. It's got tons of information, very practical. It's a thin book, easy to read. Through reading this book, a person's going to identify either the individual themselves struggling or the spouse or family member. It's those words are going to jump right at you, and you see certain indicators which will help identify if there's a real problem here.
We're actually, through this anonymous system, having a conversation with the same person who's listening and resubmitting questions. So the one who said it's not about the connection, and then you addressed it and I've learned so much tonight. Thank you so much for doing this. One of the things I've learned is that when we have a negative relationship, it's compulsive when it doesn't conform with our belief system. So that could be religious, health-wise, relationship-wise, whatever reason. When it doesn't conform with something and we can't stop, that's when it's labeled an addiction that needs to be addressed. So the person writes, I asked that last question you read about not feeling an emotional void. He said if you don't feel a consequence, it's not a pathology and doesn't matter. Now the question is for the rabbi. It's usher, that's my consequence, and I need help dealing with it. So I am the rabbi, but I pass it back to you, because that notion that it's us, you were saying that it doesn't really matter what the consequence is. The consequence that your wife will leave you, is the consequence that it's unhealthy physically, or is the consequence religiously it's impairing your faith or your religious identity, your religious journey. It doesn't matter what the consequence, whatever the reason is, whether it's a lack of connection, dysfunction, if it's making you feel bad for doing it for whatever reason and you can't stop doing it, that's exactly the definition of having a problem.
That's exactly the criteria that we look at. Those are the three primary criteria that we look at, which would dictate or really help us understand if there's an addiction here or it's just a behavior. And there's a good chance that if a person's not okay with it, whether they disagree with the rabbinic or halachic rule or they understand it fully, at the end of the day, if they're not okay with what they're doing, there's a reason it's causing a consequence. That is the definition of a pathological behavior.
Right. And sadly, too many people in that conflict will give up. In other words, if you enjoy watching pornography or acting out, and the only thing that's stopping you is the sense that there's a religious barrier to it.
Sure.
For too many people, they'd rather give up the religious barrier.
Yeah.
So either they don't believe that God really cares, they don't believe that God has consequences, they may not believe in God, but if they have to give up one of the two, they're going to give up that, which is really tragic and sad and doesn't have to be, because it is something that can be tackled.
And unfortunately, this really loops back to the shame conversation, where when you do have enmeshment, when you do have a society of competition, when you do have, everyone connected to everyone and understanding wherever people are at, there's just a higher level of shame. A person feels more embarrassed to be out there, to be seen in public. The double life that they're carrying is just exacerbated that much more. So you do have certain systemic issues that need to be looked at as well. Culture, community, the family systems, those are all important items that we look at and analyze. The behavior is not an isolated event. There is what we call the perfect storm very often that leads to this issue.
If you had to speak to children
Sure.
to educate them on this issue,
Yeah.
what would be some of the language, the vocabulary you'd use? Why would you explain to your children that we don't get that channel, or we don't watch that, or you need to have a filter on that, or that there are people out there who do, they're not bad people, that this is a legitimate drive, but it can be compulsive? How would you educate children about this?
So the most important, obviously it depends on the age of the child, but I would say the single most important component to keep in mind is that it's not emotional. That conversation is not done in an anxiety-driven way. It's not done with any shame or any fear. If a person could differentiate and isolate their emotional understanding or reaction to this issue, then the child will end up internalizing it and ultimately implementing the boundaries or the black and white thinking that's needed. But so long as it's not emotional, very often there's shock that takes place. There's more fear, there's more curiosity, and it does more harm than good.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe towards wrapping up, if we can come back to this, someone had asked the steps of recovery, what therapy looks like. So someone's identified they have a problem.
Sure.
And whether the problem exists because of lack of religious compatibility between the behavior and what they believe in, or they've been discovered by their wife or spouse or husband, or whatever the reason is, and then they're ready. Or there's an intervention done by somebody who effectively brought to their attention that they're withdrawn, that they're absentee, that there's a problem here, and that they need help with.
Yeah.
And they want. So talk to us about where they go, what do they do. Guard Your Eyes is one resource. SA meetings is a really important resource.
Sure.
What does that recovery look like? What are those, whether it's the 12 steps, you don't have to walk us through all 12 steps right now,
Sure.
but what does a life of recovery look like?
Okay.
And let me just add to that. Is this something that can be solved, or is it lifetime managed? Meaning, can you take 6 months, conquer it, solve it, take the steps, be done with it?
Yeah.
Or if you identify you have compulsivity towards this, are you now living with this? Like the alcoholic can't even have one drink.
Correct.
This is a little bit different because one can have intimacy. They just can't behave in these ways. So is this lifelong need to be managed? Can a person solve it and cure it and conquer it? What does the path of recovery look like? What's going to be involved?
Okay. So I'm going to split. It's a 2 hour. Well, I'm going to split into two. I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of the therapeutic process, and it can be implemented in various ways as it's up to the individual. But there's really two primary focus. Number one is developing, on a behavior level, creating some space between the person and the person doing that behavior, understanding the cycle of addiction, the stimuli, the preoccupation, the ritualization. That cycle that we outlined is going to be step one. It's pure behavioral. Step two is understanding what's driving that behavior. So whether it's a chaotic lifestyle balance issue, whether it's a trauma, sexual trauma, whether it's an affect or mood regulation issue, we want to identify what's driving the overwhelming emotion that person is dealing with. So number one is the behavioral, implementing the behavioral, those boundaries that we discussed. And number two is understanding the depth of what's driving that compulsive behavior. On a practical level, as far as what's available out there, there's tons of resources we talked a lot about. There are therapists that are trained in this. There are rabbis that are sensitive to this that can help direct a person to a certain way. And then there's the 12-step community, which is tremendously helpful. What it does is it breaks away the shame. It holds a person accountable, and it develops a paradigm where a person can feel that he's connected and accepted, giving him hope and watching others recover. That there's a plan for this person.
Is it fair to say that this is not healthy behavior, but normal behavior? Meaning part of the blockage of shame is that the person thinks, I'm not normal, I'm so
Yeah.
embarrassed, this is humiliating.
Sure.
So, just like a person who eats that bag of potato chips
Right.
or gives in and has the chocolate cake or is eating more than they should, and maybe they've had to loosen their belt a little bit,
Right.
that's not healthy, but they're not ashamed to go out in public. They realize that the whole world likes to eat healthy,
Yeah.
likes to eat food, and it's hard. So is it fair to say that people should have the courage by realizing that this isn't healthy, but it's normal in the sense that they are normal?
Yeah, and I think that a talk like this it's a credit to the Boca Raton Synagogue. It's a credit to the community here to be able to have this forum, because what it does is it opens a conversation, it launches a dialogue, and it starts to knock away the barriers of shame. So thank you for hosting it, and really, these are the types of events that need to take place where you can go home and you can reference a conversation like this. Hey, you're not going to believe what we, bring it up at the Shabbos table. Have a conversation with your wife. Create an environment in your
Let's
home.
just come back to the Shabbos table. How would
Okay.
you bring this up at the Shabbos table?
Well, I mean, some of the components of it, where
Okay.
we're
Compulsive
going
behavior
to talk about a policy in our house about internet use. Something as
Right.
simple as that. Your children want that. They need the structure. There's so much instability. There's so much internal chaos. Adolescent development. A child needs structure. For them, structure is safety.
Right.
So when they don't see safety, they act out because they're trying to take control. They're fearful. It's fear based. There's tons of information and resources out there available for people to engage in this process, and it's
Are there
our reality.
medications? Someone's asking. Are there medications that can help mute or diminish the compulsive urges?
Yeah, so I think
Where does
again,
chemical?
yeah,
where does
so
medication
so
come in?
there are, if there's a dual diagnosis, I mean, for sex addiction proper, it's really a behavioral approach that we've taken. If there's OCD, if there's a bipolar, if there's a co-occurring disorder, then we'll have to isolate that and medicate appropriately. So it's not a contradiction. Very often there's an interplay between the two. Again, it's about effectively and comprehensively diagnosing it so then you know what you're treating. I just want to comment about the abstinence piece.
Sure.
Because again, it's not the behavior, but it's the relationship
Abstinence from let's
the
clarify
behavior from sex.
that. We're not
essentially.
encouraging abstinence from sex.
I just want to comment on that. The recovery, what it looks like, there needs to be a place of abstinence which is short term to start differentiating the person's association with the behavior and what the behavior is really supposed to represent. Sex is a platform for connection, for intimacy, for love,
Right.
for honesty,
Right.
for vulnerability. When it's been abused, it's none of that. So the goal of that abstinence list is to start helping the person, the individual, differentiate between love and lust. And that's why we talk about abstinence in a short term to rewire your brain, essentially to develop the neurochemical reactivity towards lust, towards love and connection, as opposed to lust and isolation.
Within recovery, I know submitting to a higher power is one of the steps,
Sure.
and the notion of faith or belief,
Absolutely.
which for different people means different things, is really critical. Where does it come in from our Jewish or Torah perspective? If one loves Hashem, would they not struggle with these issues? Do we put our love of Hashem ahead of our own lust and desire, temptation, urges, sexual appetite? Where does developing a healthy sense of spirituality and spiritual identity, religious identity, and the satisfaction that comes from discipline and doing the right things, and satisfaction of knowing that Hashem loves us, and every time that we turn it off and we don't look at that thing and we don't act out in that way, even though we had the urge to, is an enormous gives great nachas ruach, gives Hashem the greatest joy. Where does that come in with recovery?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the components, one of the pillars of recovery, to be spiritually connected, to be grounded in a person's higher power. What it does is it takes there's every meeting, every NA or AA or SA meeting close with the Serenity Prayer. God, give us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. What we're doing is we're deferring our control to our higher power. When we feel we're in control, when we attempt to control, we're taking on all those powerful emotions that we can't cope with.
Right.
So being grounded spiritually, having a relationship with the higher power is such a helpful component to the recovery process, because it helps a person develop the surrender where I don't need to control this, because there's an acceptance that's developing as a result of it.
We are at an hour and a half.
Okay.
This is a topic that there's so much to say, and I want to thank you for giving your time. I want to summarize by taking some of my takeaways, what I learned
Sure.
tonight. Hopefully that'll be productive, and then give you the opportunity for the last words or what you
Okay.
want people to walk away with. But I learned about what the definition of addiction is. It's not a matter of the frequency that you do it, it's a matter of the relationship with what we're doing. Is there something I don't want to be doing, or that leaves me feeling sad or guilty about doing it, and nevertheless I feel compelled or a compulsion to do it, and that's what it means to be addicted. That's what we need to conquer. Part of the path of conquering it is understanding our routines, understanding the mood we're in, or the circumstances that enable or that really empower us to act out, and trying to stop it, not in the moment of weakness, but before we ever get to that moment of weakness, is something that's really important, to identify predictive routines, break them up, and make the decision while we still have the capacity to, while we still have the free will to make the decision. That pornography images, the amount of arousal they cause, the stimulation, it's not just something which is religiously objectionable, but it's actually negative. It rewires us in a negative way. So it has no room in the bedroom. As you said with your clients or the people that you work with, your patients, there's never been a positive outcome.
Correct.
Because there was several people who wrote that, can I watch pornography with my spouse? What if it's not outside the marriage, but it's actually trying to help the marriage? I got some emails from people who said, and identified themselves as women, that what if I want to watch something which will put me more in the mood, so it's actually contributing positively to the marriage. So what we talked about, what I learned tonight from you, is that there are maybe other ways to do that.
Correct.
Maybe reading a romantic novel for a woman is a legitimate way if she finds that she needs that. But watching these images with all that they contain is something which is categorically negative. It's not just about the circumstance or the people. I learned that too. The importance of the higher power, the importance of transparency, communication in all areas of intimacy, in all areas of life, in all areas of marriage, but particularly even when you're struggling, to be transparent, to come clean, to divulge, what was the word you used?
Disclose.
To disclose
With
the challenges
structure.
and the behavior,
Yeah.
but to disclose when there's a structure to follow up. The importance of when there's been an infidelity acting out that could just be pornography, could be more, of getting therapy, of getting help, of getting support. And you've given, I think, a lot of language and conversation for people who maybe have felt alone, maybe they felt they weren't normal, maybe they felt they were the only one, maybe they've been struggling with, am I an addict, am I not an addict, I feel miserable about this, I don't want to feel miserable, where do I go, what do I do now? So, Moshe, I can't thank you enough for doing this, and I give you the floor if you have some last thoughts you want to share.
Just a quick comment, it is a shul function, so, the famous story of Rachov, who was involved in prostitution and obviously, negative behaviors for most of her life, actually. She started, I think, at 10, and she was for over 5 decades. The storyline is expressed in Shmuel, I believe, where the Gemara analyzes what took place in her life, where she would bring in kings and noblemen and people across the lands have heard of her services, and what shifted her paradigm was when Yoshua sent the 2 spies to her home. They came up through the rope in the bedroom, and they snuck in the same way that people would sneak in. And she looked at that and she analyzes, the Gemara explains that it was that motivated her to change her life. I heard a beautiful message from Rav Schwab, actually, that explains is that she analyzed the secrecy that the people would do. They were coming for her services, they were coming to be Mazana, they were coming to engage in terrible acts, and at the same time, they knew deep down that there was something wrong, and they tried to hide from it almost. They tried to come in and sneak in the back door, if you will. And it was this that when she looked deep inside herself and she analyzed that there's something wrong with what she's been doing for all these decades, it inspired her and motivated her to change. And I think that's really kind of my hope, humbly, where she actually ended up marrying Yeshua.
I was about to say, that's the real
which is a
story.
powerful reality here, is that a person can go from such a low place, from such an inappropriate place, involved in sex addiction, perhaps you could label it, to the highest forms, the most spiritual relationship ever. The leader of our people took us into Israel, and I think that's something to keep in mind. I've had the pleasure of watching the recovery process take place. It's extremely humbling and inspiring when people acknowledge that there is hope. They take those risks and they find recovery. It's beautiful to watch, and it's something that everyone deserves. At the end of the day, it's really about finding the happiness that's given to us that we deserve. So, thank you very much for being here.
Moshe, thank you for doing this with us. We really, really appreciate it, and thank all those who've tuned in through the different mediums. And I want to thank our anonymous tech person who's helped us get through this as well. And if people have continued questions, they should feel free to use the anonymous system. I'll try to direct the best I can or answer the best I can. And I know that Moshe is happy to be a resource and take advantage of the resources like Guard Your Eyes and others. So wishing everyone a wonderful night and have a great Shabbos. Thank you very much.